Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redmond, and you can find this podcast and every other podcast I do by going to PorkinsPolicyReview.com. Well, today we are joined by someone who is fast becoming one of my favorite guests, and that is, of course, Steven Singular. Steven was just on the podcast recently to discuss his book, Legacy of Deception, which deals, of course, with the OJ Simpson trial and Mark Fuhrman and a whole bunch of different, tangents and threads all connected to that. And Steven has joined us again on the podcast because, of course, anyone that knows listening to that our first episode, we really were only able to scratch just the surface of this whole story. So I wanted to have Steven on again. But Steven Singular, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
Well, as I said, that was a fairly long podcast, and Steven did lay out essentially not only the specifics of the book, but his involvement and the main sort of pieces of the puzzle that Steven was looking into. So, of course, the EDTA in several of the blood samples that were tested, this mysterious evidence bag found next to one of the alleged gloves that Simpson had on. Of course, the stick that might have been used to move some of these things. And we talked about a few other things. But again, as I said, we really only scratched the surface of all of this. So, and again, we're only going to be able to get into so much in this second episode. But I wanted to talk about some of the kind of Mark Fuhrman timeline vis-a-vis the night of the murders, because this is a really important piece of this whole case. And again, this is something that, particularly with this FX show, I think people are starting to kind of get a particular image in their mind, especially people that are, people my age that are kind of unfamiliar with the OJ Simpson trial or with some of the events that took place on that night. I think they're looking at the FX show and that's becoming the sort of standard narrative. And also, with journalistic integrity, I actually screwed up a little bit in the first episode, and I said that Mark Fuhrman never mentioned the blood inside the Bronco in the preliminary hearing, and that I actually got mixed up. And Steven and I actually spent a day emailing back and forth and figuring out exactly what happened. But we're going to get into that. And again, I think this timeline is very important because so much of the case hinges on this. And there are so many people that will say, you're just a conspiracy theorist. There's no, even if Mark Fuhrman was a horrible racist who said terrible things and maybe he hated OJ from the beginning, it doesn't really matter because he found the gloves, he saw the blood in the car, all of that, the sort of timeline of stuff relating to that seems to sort of trump everything with them. So let's get into a little bit of that, Steven, because as I said, I did get it wrong. Fuhrman, in his preliminary hearing, does in fact refer to blood in the Bronco. Now, I guess what we should say is that's the first time in the case that we ever hear this, because when I believe it was when Shapiro was questioning Van Adder if he saw blood on the console, he did say yes, but then he couldn't come up with a real answer as to why he never wrote it down in his initial report. So that's a very important piece of the puzzle, and we're going to get to why this is even more important. There's a lot of stuff about when this blood was actually in the Bronco. But first off, Steven, Describe to us this when Fuhrman is testifying, he refers to seeing them, the gloves near Nicole's body, and you make a point about this in the book, and I think this is very important to understanding the timeline, the events that happened on the night of June 12th. So, what is so significant about Fuhrman's describing them?
Well, let's back up just a little bit, and I will address that question. But what's important for listeners to understand is that, the crimes occurred on the night of June 12, 1994, and then the preliminary hearing took place a couple of weeks later. And during the preliminary hearing, Fuhrman made a very clear reference to seeing them on the ground. He was referring to the gloves. So it was like the first slip up that he made. I mean, them means two gloves. Well, the standard narrative version of the case is one glove was on the ground at the crime scene, one glove was over at OJ's. So that was a problem right from the beginning. Why my role has some possible significance here is that about 6 weeks after the crimes, I was contacted by somebody within LA's legal system and asked, to talk about the OJ Simpson case. The reason that happened, and that sounds a little far-fetched to people. I live in Denver. The crimes are in LA. But my first book was called Talk to Death, The Life and Murder of Alan Berg. And it was about the neo-Nazi assassination of this Denver talk show host, Alan Berg. The Oliver Stone movie, Talk Radio, is somewhat based upon that book. So the reason that I was contacted, I had many sources in law enforcement as a result of that book. And I was investigating racism, neo-Nazis, anti-Semitism, all the things that led to Berg's death. And so kind of out of the blue, I was contacted by someone who said, not every act of domestic terrorism is about somebody assassinating someone or shooting them. There are more subtle ways of doing things. And I said, well, what does that mean? And the source said, do you want to talk about the OJ Simpson case? And I said, not really. I had spent 2 or 3 years investigating neo-Nazis, and that was enough for me. And I didn't want to get involved in the subject again. And I was basically told that there are people of the sort who killed Berg that they're not all living in the woods in Idaho, that some of them are inside the system. Some of them are very disruptive and even dangerous to our legal system. And I wasn't persuaded by anything by this, but we talked, and I was told, if I were given 3 or 4 pieces of information, could I get it to the defense? And if I could, it could likely impact the trial because they did not know about this information at that time. So the beginning of the story really goes back to my writing that first book, being contacted by somebody in early August of 94 and saying, contact the defense and give them this information. And I more or less told that story in our first interview, so I don't need to go over all of it. What's important, critically important in the narrative, and what you'll never see on FX or any of these other shows, is that I was told on that first day from the very beginning, there were 4 pieces of information which I talked about, but another one was that Fuhrman did not make one trip over to OJ's house that night. We all know the official story. Fuhrman, his partner, Van Adder and Lang, 2 senior detectives, have arrived at the crime scene 4 or 5 in the morning and basically taken the case away from Fuhrman. So what I was told was that Fuhrman made a trip prior. Well, those 4 detectives go over to OJ's house. We all know that.
Right.
But what I was told was that about 3 a.m., Fuhrman talked his partner into going over to OJ's to look for evidence. Very critical information. And because he was absolutely convinced already of who committed the crime, that there would be evidence over there, and that they would find it, and it would, help solve the case. So I was told, and I'm prefacing every sentence here with that phrase because this is the information that's given to me. We'll see how it plays out as I tell you the story. So I was told that he and his partner went over there around 3 a.m. They got into a very loud argument on OJ's property because they didn't find any evidence. There was nothing there. And so it was unprofessional, leave the crime scene, just go off on a wild goose chase, and they argued about it. Now,
we just got cut off there for a second. Just a bad connection on Skype. But Stephen, continue with what you were saying. You were again talking about this the first trip that
right.
Fuhrman allegedly took to Rockingham and the fight that ensued when they couldn't find anything.
So I was told that they made a trip around 3 a.m. There was a loud argument that ensued, and that no evidence was found over there. Fuhrman came back to the crime scene. He was alone, at least briefly, with the victims, the bodies there at Nicole's condo. And I basically laid out last time the story of the stick and the bag, and the bag and the stick that were eventually located at OJ's, that I was told was how the glove was moved from one location to another. But to play out the 3 a.m. trip, if for those who followed the trial closely, the housekeeper next to OJ's property was a woman named Rosa Lopez. And Rosa Lopez was interviewed by Mark Fuhrman the morning after the crimes. In other words, Fuhrman and the detectives had gone over to OJ's at about 6 a.m., and that's when Fuhrman says he found the glove, and he went around the neighborhood a little bit and talked to people. And he talked to Rosa Lopez, and she said, I heard two men arguing on OJ's property at about 3 in the morning. It must have awakened her. It was that one. And Fuhrman, of course, took note of this, and he said, I'll get back to you on this. Well, he never got back to her on that. That was not the story he wanted anybody to know about. The defense did learn about this. I think I told them, other people may have told them about this incident. Rosa Lopez did testify at the trial, and she did talk about hearing this argument on OJ's property, which essentially confirms exactly what I was told in the first meeting with my source in talking about this case. I think it's kind of important for people listening to pull back and understand that while this was the most covered criminal case in American legal history, there are a lot of pieces about it that aren't very well known, and they're important pieces of information. And what the only thing that can give me any credibility as a journalist or as someone speaking to peers is whether the information I was told turned out to be accurate or played out in the legal system in some way. That's the only credibility I could claim to have in this. I was coming in as a total outsider, given information that had to then go into the legal system and play out in some way. So if you look at our last interview, where I talked about a stick being a part of the case, the stick was entered into evidence and entered into the trial on February 22nd, 1995. The bag was entered into evidence on the same date by the defense. The story of Rosa Lopez played out in the trial when she testified that she heard about this argument. I was told that Fuhrman and Nicole had a relationship that went beyond him just going over to OJ's one time during a domestic dispute. There's an internal affairs report that talks about Fuhrman bragging to police officers about seeing Nicole Simpson's boob job, etc. A number of people within the legal system came forward and said this guy talks about her, has some relationship with her, not suggesting intimacy, but something beyond just one encounter. That played out in the course of the legal system in the trial. And then the biggest piece of information had to do with the blood preservative in these critical pieces of blood evidence involving Simpson. So it's just important for people to understand that you're not getting the whole picture of this case through FX or through a lot of means. And if you're serious about trying to understand what went on and why the jury came to the conclusion they did and why they did it so easily. It's, I think, important to pay attention to some of this other information.
Absolutely. And again, we were talking in some emails a week back or so about the Rosa Lopez, her testimony, but also her portrayal on the FX show. I was telling you is very comical, and I guess in reality she wasn't a great witness. There were, she claimed not to speak English, but she had like an interpreter at the courtroom, but she did know English, obviously, because she had spoken to Fuhrman and some other people before that. There was a whole question, there were all these rumors that OJ was paying her. I think that was really just the media trying to make something out of Rosa Lopez. And again, I mean, let's be, there's a sort of hint of racism in all of this, that, and she wanted to go back to El Salvador. She was very kind of paranoid about being involved in the case.
We can speculate endlessly about the media spin on it. What we can't speculate about is that I was told that they made 2 trips, and the very next morning she told Fuhrman about hearing an argument on OJ's property. That is factual information that came out in the course of the trial. And what is so difficult about all of this is to keep the emphasis on the factual, to keep it on the things that we can actually establish with certainty. And to pull the lens back a little bit further, and this may sound obvious to people, but I want to say it anyway. If Mark Fuhrman does not, I have quotes here around the word found or find, if that glove is not on OJ's property, a double homicide murder investigation has to be done, has to unfold after, at that point, June 13th, 1994. By him saying that he found this glove there, he's also, based upon what the story that I just told you, if you think about it very clearly, that they went there to find evidence of the murder, either in the Bronco, on the ground, on the property, in the house, wherever. There was no evidence. If that narrative is true, and everything we know seems to establish that it's true, then when they go back, he has now talked the 2 senior officers in this case to going over to OJ's at 6 o'clock in the morning. Why did they do that? They don't have a search warrant. They do it because he says, we're going to find evidence over there. We're going, or somebody's going to kill somebody over there, or whatever the rationale is. That's his doing. That's what he did. So if you follow the story, when he goes back there, he damn well has to find some evidence, or he's going to look very foolish. And he's going to look very flawed in the eyes of his superiors, because these are his superiors. So when he goes back to Rockingham, the first thing he does is get rid of the other 3 detectives. Follow the case closely. He plants them in the house with OJ's daughter, Arnell, and he says, I'll go out and take a look around. And the next thing that happens is he claims to find that glove. And right next to that glove is found a blue plastic evidence bag that would very easily hold a bloody glove. And out on OJ's property by his truck is found a broken stick. And these are the things I spoke about the last time we talked. You cannot overemphasize the fact that when that glove is found, the yellow crime scene tape goes around OJ's place and the murder investigation is done. You can't, again, if that sounds obvious, it's not. What do I mean when I say that? What I mean is there are 2 victims here. One is Nicole Simpson. Fuhrman's belief from the very beginning, not only is that OJ killed these 2 people, but that Nicole had to be the target. If there was a murder investigation done, a real one, which has never happened, ever, there are 2 victims. Who's the other victim? What is his background? What is his possible connection to this situation? These are the questions that have never been asked. They've never been allowed to be asked in a public forum that I've seen or been, in my 21 years of following the case. 22. If a murder investigation had been done, all of these things would have been explored, and that the police, the detectives, the people who know how to do these investigations would have learned some very, very interesting things.
Well, and I think we're definitely going to get into that in a little bit later. Particularly, the idea was Ronald Goldman really the target of this murder, and Nicole just can happen to be there. But I just wanted to also get a few more things, because again, it is so important, and this is something that you reiterated in our first interview, in the book, and in our emails to one another, is just the importance of actually looking at the factual evidence, not looking at the hype, not looking at the sort of media story about this. And you were just saying again that the whole, when Fuhrman is like, we have to go back, or we have to go there because we're going to find the evidence. And again, he also mentions some other he mentions the fact that Nicole and OJ have joint custody of their children, which is, how did he know that? Was this a public, did everybody in Los Angeles know this, or did somehow Fuhrman seem to know some sort of intimate details about the custody of their children? But when he does go back, Fuhrman, of course, is again the one that speaks to Cato Kalin, which was the, if people want to say that Rosa Lopez was a terrible witness for the defense, Cato was a pretty awful witness for the prosecution. Now, when he talks to Cato, we hear about these infamous 3 thumps that Cato hears in the middle of the night. And he lived in sort of the pool house, the sort of guest house on OJ's property. And then Fuhrman does a really odd thing. He and I want you to talk about this a little bit. He takes Cato inside to talk to Van Adder and Lang, and then Fuhrman goes by himself and then mysteriously finds the glove. And again, if this seems odd, they don't know what's really going on. The whole idea is that, well, OJ's the killer. He could be on the property, So Fuhrman goes by himself. So explain a little bit about that, because that's another very important piece to this puzzle.
Well, the important part of it is that Fuhrman has to get rid of everybody. He has to be alone. And he is alone. He's got 3 detectives with him. He puts them in the house. He talks to Cato, and he puts Cato in the house. And the next thing that happens is he claims to find this glove, laying on the ground. I mean, there are all kinds of technical things surrounding the glove, like if it had been dropped or fallen off somebody's hands, it would have had debris on it, which it didn't. If it were laying out all night, it's 6 in the morning. This happened at 10 at night. That's 8 hours. The glove would be dry or drying. Mm-hmm. It's not. It's wet. What would keep a glove wet? Well, what would keep a glove wet is being squished up in a little small plastic bag. That would keep it from drying. But the critical point is that he has to be alone. And then, as we referred last time we spoke, I believe that when he's talking to this screenwriter, Laura McKinney, about his involvement in the case, and this is when the case is unfolding, he says, I'm the single most important witness in this case because of the glove. The glove goes down, bye-bye. He knows there's no other evidence.
Yeah, very arrogant.
There's no murder weapon. There's no witnesses. The timeline is absolutely problematic. There's 17 fingerprints at the crime scene that can't be identified. There's DNA on the bodies that doesn't belong to any known person. The first coroner says 2 knives were used, implying 2 killers, not 1. They have the glove. They don't have anything else. And that's the statement. The thing about Fuhrman that's fascinating is that he always manages to sort of reveal himself, whether he wants or not. Or when he, from the very beginning, under oath says, I saw them on the ground. He tells you what he saw right there. And when I was contacted and the first conversation was held, I was told he's already given up the game right there. The source said, go look at preliminary hearing testimony. He's already said he saw 2 gloves. It was a matter of what is the evidence that substantiates that? And unfortunately, the trial didn't create a strong enough scenario, in my opinion, by the defense to show what had actually happened.
Right. It seems, again, that the defense's, goal or strategy in mind was just to, again, go up to the water's edge but not get their feet wet. So just plant enough doubt in the minds of the jury in order for them to acquit, not to actually figure out who was responsible. And I mean, again, that's not necessarily the defense's job. It's not to solve the case.
Right.
But they could have very well presented, here's the real killer, and then given all the evidence to show that this person is guilty and not OJ.
Well, what they could have done, it would have been very difficult for them to show the real killer, because that's a whole other investigation. That's a whole other show. What they could have done is to say OJ Simpson was not acquitted because of race. Yes, race was a factor. Yes, racism was a factor. But there is real physical evidence that shows what happened against him in this case. And it involves the glove, and just as critically, it involves the blood evidence against him. And if you pay attention to what was done with that blood evidence, it becomes very clear why the jury did what it did. Mm-hmm. There was more than reasonable doubt. You're right. All the defense is trying to do is create reasonable doubt, not show you a blow-by-blow scenario of what happened.
Well, let's touch again on this blood evidence, and again, because I did screw up the last time we were talking in terms of when the blood was seen within the Bronco. Now, again, for instance, in the FX TV show, you see all of them looking. They look at the speck of blood on the car, and then they look inside the car, and they see blood on the console, and then they hop the fence into OJ's. Now, Fuhrman does, in fact, say in his preliminary hearing that I forget what it was exact. You sent me the exact quote, but he says something to the effect of coupled with the blood inside the car, we proceeded to hop the fence. Now, this is the first time that it's mentioned, and again, as I said, when Shapiro cross-examined Van Adder, and Van Adder did say, yeah, we saw blood on the console. But when he was asked, why wasn't that in your initial report, he didn't really have much of an answer to this. Now, again, you were told by your source that someone took the bloody glove, assuming this is probably Fuhrman, and at some point in time actually wiped it on the console and on the carpet of the car. And this is how we get the fibers from the Bronco on the glove, and this is how we get Nicole and Ron's blood in the car. And again, this is all okay, fine, maybe that happened, but there's a really key part to all of this, and again, this is solid evidence, testimony, and this is, of course, Kelly Muldorfer. And right. Stephen, explain this, because this is a really important part.
I think when those officers are over there, it is essentially dark. I don't know. I'm not at all certain how you could see blood in the Bronco in virtual darkness. When I actually saw those pictures later, Carl Douglas of the defense showed them to me, and it's not like pools of blood, on the seat or anything like that. That's one issue. The bigger issue, the much bigger and more troubling issue, is that a police officer, Kelly Muldorfer, a police officer, testified that they were in the Bronco 3 or 4 days after it had been impounded. Let's emphasize this, 3 or 4 days later, and saw no blood whatsoever in the Bronco. That's a problem. That's not me speculating. That, again, is a factual observation made by a police officer. So the clear implication is that blood was not there the morning of the crime and was there at some later point, based on the sworn testimony of a police officer. And Fuhrman, I don't know, again, when he's giving his preliminary hearing testimony, he just throws that out. And I based on what I saw, I don't see how you would see that in the Bronco unless you were inside the Bronco. But the Muldorfer testimony is the key piece of information.
Yeah, and again, the Bronco was broken into at least once or twice while it was at the impound?
Right. Yeah, correct.
So, right, again, and this, so, I mean...
That we know, that we know. So,
and with this, I mean, this is something that in almost any other murder case, this would be huge. That a piece of evidence like this, a car is broken into twice,
right.
While it's at an impound. I mean, would be like, a mistrial or something. This is a massive thing that you're talking about. Again, one of the key pieces of evidence, and it's broken into. And again, there's no blood in the car 4 days after it's impounded, and then the blood seems to appear. And again, very important is that to make clear that when Van Adder, when Lang, when Fuhrman are talking about seeing blood inside the car, there was no blood. So they're perjuring themselves in trial.
They had to have a rationalization for essentially violating Simpson's Fourth Amendment rights and jumping over his fence, at that point. I mean, they had to rationalize it in some way, and that's what they did.
Right.
So it's on Sunday. This is just an aside, but on Sunday I was watching television and they were showing. They called the real OJ Simpson trial, I guess, as opposed to the FX thing. And it was fascinating because I hadn't watched it for 20 years or so, and they were giving closing arguments on the prosecution, and lawyers do this. I'm not saying it's that extraordinary, but you could just see this incredible effort on the part of Marcia Clark in particular to create a scenario that implicated Simpson. And it's a somewhat subtle point, but it's important. I mean, in other words, most prosecutors do not rely upon pure speculation to figure out how a crime may have been committed. And I was just really struck by it. OJ was in a blind rage. OJ and Cato went to McDonald's, and OJ didn't have enough money to pay for it, so Cato paid for the burgers. And then he was in a blind rage. I mean, there are photos, if not video, of OJ with Nicole and Nicole's family and his children at 6 o'clock that evening at the recital. They're smiling, they're hugging. It's just such a stretch to try to figure out where the blind rage developed between the 6 o'clock recital, the 9:30 eating burgers with Cato, and this incredibly vicious crime. I mean, it's pure speculation. That's all I'm saying. If you had witnesses, a normal prosecuting thing is to say, we have a witness that puts the defendant here. We have a timeline. He punched in with some sort of card that establishes he was here. We have a video camera up in the corner that shows him entering the 7-Eleven at 10:07:15.
Right.
That's the way you prosecute somebody. It was so evident 20 years later looking at it that they have to come up with a story that justifies their prosecution, just as they had to come up with a story that allowed them to jump over OJ's fence. They had to have it. And when a police officer shows up 4 days afterwards and says, I was in that Bronco in pure daylight looking around. My job is to look for evidence, and there's nothing there. That's a problem. Just like you said, that is a vast prosecutorial problem. And these are the facts. This is what happened. Now, this isn't my speculation, your speculation. This is based upon sworn testimony. Follow it closely, and you can learn a lot of new things about this case.
Oh, and just quickly again, there's also there's the blood on the back gate of Nicole's condo, and I believe it's on June 13th. There's no blood, and then on July 3rd, it's visible. This is from pictures, and this blood was also tested, and that there was.
This goes to the heart of my own involvement, which I essentially laid out last week. So I don't want to repeat everything, but when blood is drawn from a defendant or potential defendant, it's put in a tube to be preserved so it can be tested for DNA or other things. Simpson's blood was drawn on the 13th of June, right after he came back from Chicago, stored in one of these vials, and that blood contains a preservative. So if you test that blood and the preservative shows up, that means without any doubt whatsoever, it did not come out of the defendant's body on the night of the crime. It came out later after it was drawn. I told the defense test that the blood in this case would have OJ's DNA in it. No question about it. But if it contained this preservative, it did not come out of his body on the night of the crime. Ultimately, through a long story, some of the blood did get tested. One of these samples is what you're referring to, and EDTA, the preservative, was found in that sample, meaning that somebody put it there. Somebody took it out of his blood vial and put it there for the obvious reason of implicating him in this crime. Yeah. And again, you're right. This is mistrial stuff. That right there should have stopped the trial cold and said, well, what's going on? It didn't, not only did it not do that, it's not information that the general public really has any understanding of, because press was as complicit as everybody else in this thing and saying this guy's guilty. We're just not going to focus on anything that questions his guilt.
Mm. Oh, I mean, there's also the I think it's when you talk about when Barry Scheck is talking to Dennis Fung, who's the head criminalist. He shows him different pictures from, again, inside the Bronco, and it appears that the later picture, there's pictures taken at several, just at the beginning. I believe they're pictures and samples collected on June 15th, but then on August 26th, it seems like there's even more blood inside the car, and Fung is very vague about all of this, but he does have this weird comment where he says something to the effect, again, that basically his superiors wish that he had collected more blood back in June. So I don't, we can, I guess, speculate on what that means, but again, it's very interesting that the blood seems to disappear and reappear in multiple places, inside the car, on the back gate. And again, the crime scene was also washed very, very early on, right. Which is, again, never done. Why would they ever do this? But I wanted to move on to a different part of this. And again, we're going to kind of, I guess, talk about stuff that goes a little bit beyond what you laid out in Legacy of Deception. But quickly, I wanted to talk about, because you make a really excellent point, and I think many people within the alternative media or conspiracy culture, and I've been guilty of this myself, when you see something, say like the OJ case, and you want to immediately think of this as a large, massive conspiracy, involving everybody and every single person involved with this has some sort of nefarious stake in all of this. But you lay out that in terms of the actual quote-unquote criminal investigation, all of the misdeeds and whatnot, that this was probably very small. You only needed like 3 people max to do this. So you say, in terms of the conspiracy, at least in the actual evidence, you only need a couple of people. And I wanted you to just kind of talk about that, because you talk about you just need one person to move the glove, one person to plant some of the blood. And that's essentially it. So just talk about that, and then we'll kind of get into some of the other issues.
It's a critical point, because people throw around the term conspiracy theory very lightly, and it does very little to illuminate the reality of things. There's no conspiracy in what I'm saying. I'm talking about evidence in a criminal case that came out in due process. That's the way our system works. There's no conspiracy involved in that. It goes back to what I said about 20 minutes earlier. When Fuhrman moved the glove, or when I was told that Fuhrman moved his glove and given pieces of evidence to substantiate that, that's what I was told. That was the allegation. When that occurs, it shuts down the entire investigation. And I've heard Tom Lang, the investigator who was over there that morning, the senior investigator, Van Ander's dead, but Lang is alive, and say, we had no reason to suspect any other person at that point. Again, this is a huge thing. So that is one action. The other action, and it involves Dennis Fung, whom you were just talking about, is that we know for a fact that when OJ came back from Chicago, goes to the police station, doesn't ask for a lawyer, gives his blood sample, hands it over to the authorities, doesn't question this, doesn't ask for a lawyer again, that normal chain of custody in a criminal case is that blood vial is sealed and it's entered into evidence at what in LA is called the Parker Center. And the great resistance from the defense to me, based on what I was saying about the blood, was they said that's what happened. Fung testified, and I think there's video, that in fact Van Adder took that blood vial, he left the police station, he left the interview room, he had that in his possession for the next 3 or 4 hours. He's going to the crime scene, he's wandering around LA, and eventually later that afternoon, much later, he hands it over to Dennis Fung. We know that Simpson gave 8 milliliters of blood to the authorities. We know this. This is fact. We know that when the blood vial comes back, there's 6.5 milliliters. 1.5 milliliters of blood is missing. Where did it go? That's a second individual that we're talking about here. And we can assume, based upon the crime lab, well, let me back up. OJ's civil trial, the civil trial of Simpson occurred in the summer or in 1996. The testimony of people within the LAPD crime lab is that Van Adder did not only have Simpson's blood vials, he had the blood vials of Nicole and Ron as well in his possession at that time. That's from inside the legal system itself. So the principles of all 3 people, the blood of all 3 people, is in his possession. What do we know from that? What did Marcia Clark say in her final, in her wrap-up closing argument? That these 3 samples of blood are on that glove. How did they get there? We know that Van Adder had that in his possession. What we also know, and I was somewhat involved in it just a little bit, but that one of the people working in the crime lab, Andrea Mazzola, a junior person, said that she took these blood swatches that would be tested for the critical DNA, and she put her initials on them, and they were sent off to the lab in Maryland for DNA testing. And when those swatches arrived, based on the testimony, her initials were not there. What does that tell you? That the swatches she was working with did not arrive at the lab. Something else did. So how many people are you talking about? 2, 3? And when this happens, I mean, everybody else in the system, and I mean a lot of very good people, a lot of people who wouldn't violate the law, a lot of people who believe in what they're doing, just naturally fall in line behind it. It's not a conspiracy. It's a sweetening of the evidence against the defendant. Who is the defendant in this case? OJ Simpson. What does that tell you? He's going to go out and hire the best legal representation he can find, unlike 20,000 other defendants who are going to be accused of something and don't have the resources to do that. And many of them might plead guilty to a crime they didn't even commit to avoid going to trial. That happens all the time. So what do you know right from the start? That this guy is going to fight this with everything he's got, and he's got a lot of resources to fight. So you're going to need the best evidence you can come up with. And so to me, the word conspiracy theory, when you're a journalist, is a very nefarious term, because I'm not sitting here saying, okay, I know who committed this crime. I can tell you exactly what happened. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, how did the evidence play out that we're talking about in the course of the trial that led the jury to conclude what it did? That the most basic aspect of it is that the evidence could not be trusted. And this is based on the testimony that I've just recounted. Who am I talking about? I'm talking about criminalist Dennis Fung saying Van Adder had the vial. I'm talking about a man named Gary Siegler who worked in the crime lab who said Van Adder had the other 2 vials. I'm talking about Andrea Mazzola's testimony at trial that she signed these things, and they don't show up at the lab with her initials on them. That's not a conspiracy. That just completely negates the reality behind this case. And the unfortunate thing with FX and a lot of other things is that we're just, the work you're doing, Pierce, is just beginning to penetrate that facade. It's just starting to happen. 22 years after the fact. And there's plenty there to substantiate why this case went down the way it did. It wasn't because of a bunch of stupid people on the jury made a bad decision. That's what we've been fed for 22 years. And if you think that's not tinged with racism, I suggest you think again. This case is about more than race. It's about evidence. And the hue and cry of the mainstream media and the commentators forever has been, what a stupid bunch of jurors. Think about that for a minute. They were sequestered for 9 months to study the evidence in this case, and that's exactly what they did. And they looked at the evidence and they said, there really is only one piece of evidence here that counts, and that's the blood. And if you can explain how the blood got where it was, and all these timeline issues like you're talking about, it's in the Bronco, it's not in the Bronco, there's more here, there's less at this time. That's not trustworthy evidence. And if you put the pieces together, you begin to get an understanding of what happened. And I think because this case has been so prominent in our history, and because it involves all these critical racial and legal issues, I think we have some sort of obligation to try to understand it. And so what you're doing is a very worthwhile thing, even if it's an uphill battle. And so I hope that people will pay attention to some of these things.
Yeah, again, it is all right there in front of you. It just takes a few moments to just kind of sit down and look at it, in a calm, logical sort of a manner. And just to reiterate with the constant that jury was stupid, but again, the all-white jury that convicted him in the civil trial, they were all smart. Right. That was the good jury. But unfortunately, we had the bad jury with, mostly people of color on that jury. I do want to move on to another part of this because I think again, it is important to understand the evidence. And what did acquit OJ of this trial. But beyond that, there are questions of, well, what really happened the night of June 12th? What caused this? And for me, that is also an important aspect of this because not only, obviously the essentially framing OJ, denying him his constitutional rights, all these things, these are huge implications. But on the other hand, there's also two people that were murdered, and if OJ didn't do it, then who did? And there are a couple different little tangents to this, and again, we're not going to be able to cover all of them in this podcast or in a whole other podcast, but there were some things I know, Stephen, you've talked about that were taken out of your book that sort of revolve around the drug scene, particularly cocaine, both in Los Angeles, like in Brentwood, but also in Aspen, in Colorado, where you live. Could you kind of get into that? Because there is, for anyone that doesn't know, Ronald Goldman is a very interesting individual who is virtually kind of non-existent. It's all about Nicole, because again, it's all about, well, OJ was in a violent rage and he was jealous, and Ronald Goldman was just sort of collateral damage. But for anyone that doesn't know, and T.H. Johnson, who's a writer and a researcher, and Stephen, you know him quite well, he's done a lot of work on this, and he was able to find that not only does Ronald Goldman have a criminal file, but it's like 6 inches thick, and it's sealed because he was a confidential informant for the LAPD. Now, what the hell was he informing on? And Johnson also found out that he worked in a park and was alleged to have been a cocaine dealer in the park. He managed to, he had over $20,000 of bench warrants out for him. Never went to jail. His father's second wife, his stepmother, was married to a very nefarious character in Chicago, huge cocaine trafficker, Marvin Glass, who also happened to be in Los Angeles at the exact same time as these murders. But there's a lot more to this, and again, there's also the Aspen connection, and then there's also, again, the phone records. Why is everybody, including OJ, kind of nervous about releasing these phone records between Nicole and her mother, what was on Nicole's phone record. So talk a little bit about this, Stephen, and particularly what you kind of were able to dig up initially when you were working on Legacy of Deception.
Well, I think the starting place for that is to go back to what I said a little earlier in the program, is that if that glove is not found on Simpson's property, there has to be a double murder investigation. There has to. And so what might you learn if you did that? What you might learn is that the previous summer of 1993, Goldman has an acquaintance named Brett Cantor. And Brett Cantor, they were all involved in the nightlife scene out there, and he gets his throat slit from ear to ear, and was murdered in an unsolved case. Exactly what happens to Goldman a year later. You would learn that all of the people in this circle have some connection to the drug culture, all or most all. Nicole Simpson's best friend, so to speak, Faye Resnick, has just entered into a drug rehab facility. Prior to this, they're actually speaking the night of the crime. You would learn that in time that another acquaintance of Goldman's named Michael Nigg, who is Colorado, and who sort of helped establish his Colorado connection in the summer of 95, will be murdered in an unsolved case. So you have three men, they have some nexus between these three young men, all murdered violently in unsolved cases. You would learn that about 2 weeks after this famous case in LA, the Simpson-Goldman case, three other people that OJ was associated with on some level in his past were murdered very violently in Florida. You would learn that people were convicted of using West Side Los Angeles restaurants as places of cocaine distribution. A man named Joey Ippolito and partner Ronnie Lorenzo were convicted of doing this prior to this case. Ippolito got out of prison. There are a lot of questions that swirl around him. You would learn that certain people who worked for the restaurants were used to, the common term is mule, to deliver drugs, to collect money, et cetera, et cetera. So you would have opened up an entire subculture around these people that would have had to have been investigated. And you would have learned more about probably the fact that the first coroner testified that two knives were used in this case, that it implied two killers, that you basically had two people killed with a knife without anybody making any noise. How does one person do that? Think about that a little bit. It's screamingly obvious without saying, I know exactly what happened or who did this. What is screamingly obvious is that a murder investigation was never done here. If the door was never opened. And it was not opened because one human being made an assumption about this case from the very beginning. And if that assumption hadn't been made, there would have been a murder investigation. And we would be sitting in, I believe, an entirely different place today. And it goes back to the very start of what we started talking about, which is Fuhrman's racist belief systems, like those of the people I wrote about and Phil Allen Berg, that the thing they hated above all was seeing a black man dating or married to a white woman. This was intolerable. Fuhrman had said or noted that if he saw a black man and a white woman in LA, he would find some reason to stop them and question them. That set of assumptions started and launched this whole thing. And the tragedy of it, beyond the fact these two young people were killed, and that is tragic, is that we've never gotten past that to below the surface of the case. We can possibly still do that. I don't know about that. But the constant reiteration of these basic things, that the jury was stupid, that Fuhrman was a bad guy, but he framed the right man, all of that narrative has gotten us nowhere. It's deepened the racial divide in America. It's brought forth these feelings about in the minority communities about police and police officers and Black Lives Matter and all of that. I mean, when do we stop and say, what is the social obligation to actually figure out what happened here and what it means? Mm-hmm. And to lay aside these absolutely easy assumptions and these absolutely mindless things that people repeat over and over again and break it down and look at it and say, what can we learn from this? The main thing we can learn is just how easily we can be manipulated. A handful of images, a handful of words, and you can control an entire population. You can make them believe anything you want them to believe. And it's time to move past that. This is probably the most important criminal case in American history because of the racial dynamic. And we owe it to ourselves, I think everybody, black, white, everybody, to learn more about it and to try and establish some reality around it. And anybody who tries to do that, I think, deserves some credit. So anyway, that's my speech. But I've lived for 22 years with going to parties and just having people repeat the same three mindless things, and it doesn't get us anywhere. We've never lived in such an age of information and such an age of knowledge and opportunity, and we should use it to try and learn something about ourselves and our society.
No, and again, there's a great quote in your book from your source, and he's talking again about the whole sort of how this case again went from possibly looking into drug trafficking and organized crime, and instead turned into it's all about OJ. And your source said, quote, "It's not a conspiracy of bad intentions. Most of these people are very good. It's a conspiracy of misperception." And again, that's just as you said, from the very beginning, this becomes, it's got to be about this. So let's go with this. Let's not look into any of the outstanding or bizarre people connected to this small group of people, what they're doing in their jobs, other people that are murdered. Again, the drug trafficking angle, all of this gets ignored. And again, there's something that you were saying to me in our emails, and maybe we'll kind of leave on this point, but you were talking again, you just said that this is the most important trial in American history, and I would agree with you because there's so many reasons behind this. Again, in the alternative media, people look at moments like 9/11 or Iraq and all these, all the lies involved in a lot of this. And how, that was when we were all, became the sheeple and stuff. But you were talking to me about the concept that no, this really goes back to OJ. If you can convince enough people with all of the evidence in front of you, I mean, you said at the very beginning of this podcast, this was like the most covered case in terms of media exposure in American history, and yet we don't really know anything about the truth of this.
Right.
Even with all of this coverage, we are still getting this sterilized view.
That's the great irony of it. So what? I mean, I was born in 1950, so in 1972, when Watergate began, I was about 22, and the thing that you have to understand, and maybe you have to be a little bit older for people in your audience, is that there was a time when investigative journalism really mattered. I mean, it brought down the Nixon administration. It revealed all kinds of truths about Vietnam. It played a role in the Iran-Contra scandal in the 1980s. And with the rise of cable television and the talk show media, it's been on its deathbed ever since. And it's hard to argue against those things. I mean, they do some amount of good. But what they have created is this incredibly impenetrable wall of opinion. And again, maybe a little bit of a speech here, but what our forefathers created in the United States and what is historically of incredible value is that these people came from a place where a king could make the rules and a king could mete out justice. And they said, when we create our system, we're not going to have that. Somebody's opinion doesn't count for anything. We're going to create a courtroom and a legal system where evidence is going to be tested and presented in court, where hearsay is not going to be permitted, where witnesses are going to be cross-examined, where this stuff is going to be held up to great scrutiny, because the state does not have the power to take away somebody's life unless they can prove that they're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the foundation of the United States. And basically what we've done in the last 20 to 25 years is throw that out the window and say it counts for nothing. What's important is my opinion. And I know that OJ Simpson is guilty because that's my opinion, because somebody on TV told me that. This is important stuff, folks. This, you can agree with me or disagree with me, but the foundation of our country was based upon creating those rules. It's called due process. So if you or I are accused of something and we didn't do it, we can get a fair shake in court that you can't get all over the world. But we can get it here because the system was set up that way. And even people who don't have money get the right to legal representation for free. This is a great, great thing. To throw it out the window based on the opinion of Geraldo Rivera or somebody else telling you what to think is a very bad and dangerous thing. It goes so far beyond the OJ Simpson case, and we need to get to that discussion because these things are not set in stone. They can be taken away from you. They can be lost. And that's the underlying process that's going on here. And so you can have a television series reiterating exactly the same thing. This guy's guilty. Mm-hmm. Let's ignore what happened with the evidence. Let's ignore all of those things because our opinion is what matters. When you're the one accused of a crime, and I think minority people understand this a lot better than most white people do. When you're the one accused of a crime and you didn't commit that crime, or you're being accused of something you didn't do, these things then become important. And it's not just cocktail party chatter. There's a reason there have been those protests in the streets from the black community and the Black Lives Matter and all of those things, because they've had to deal with it a lot more than white people. And that's what can be extracted and learned from this. To let a blatantly racist, violent neo-Nazi control this situation over the last 22 years is absolutely shameful. And we owe it to ourselves to get below the surface of this case and to start to understand these things and to realize how easily we can be manipulated. And that's the bigger story. That's the bigger point. I don't know who committed these crimes. I'm not telling you that. But what I'm telling you is that these are major, major issues in how our society and culture operate. It's why there's such a racial divide in the country. It's why it's so problematical. It's why somebody like Donald Trump, who knows nothing about politics or the legal system, can run for the president of the United States. It started with OJ. The people who don't know or care anything about it rose to the top and said, this is what happened. What if they're dead wrong? Look at what it's cost us. So we can do better than this. That's all I'm saying. And there's a lot to learn here. And I hope people can extract something from this that they don't see as a conspiracy theory, but that they can see as real journalism. Because journalism has value. And so that's my take on this. I hope it's of some value to the listeners.
Well, it's definitely of huge value to me, and I know that my listeners are also really really taking this to heart. And I've gotten pretty much nothing but positive feedback on having you on, Stephen. So I'd love to have you back on again at some point, and I'm pretty sure that we will, because again, there's so much more. There's so much more to this case in terms of the cultural and societal impact that we're still feeling today, and the way that we are convinced of certain events and the sort of evidence, quote unquote, as to why we do certain things. I think much of this does go back to 1993, 1994, when this case actually happened. But before we leave, Stephen, I totally forgot to mention the last time we talked, but you have a brand new book out that you wrote along with your wife, Joyce, and it is called Shadow on the Mountain. And why don't you just give us a brief little description about this?
Yeah, it's sometimes in this job you write books that you think have, some real social importance, and sometimes you just try to tell a good crime story. And this is more the latter. It's about the murder of a socialite in Aspen by an anesthesiologist in Denver. Apparently, I mean, it seems like a very simple case on the surface, but the further you go into it, you're not sure if the doctor really did commit the crime or if he just took the rap for it to protect some other people. And it raises all kinds of questions. So I think it's a really good read. Aspen's a fascinating place. The way it's worked out legally is interesting. So, it's a good mystery story. And I think people would enjoy it. And again, all the books are on www.Stephen, that's STEPHEN, singular, SINGULAR.com. You can read more about all the books there.
Absolutely. And again, I included a link to a couple articles on Stephen's book in the last podcast, and I'll do the same for this. And I actually think most of my listeners would be really fascinated by this because, again, there's a whole Hollywood angle with this case, including Jack Nicholson and Michael Douglas and Goldie Hawn. So a lot going on there. And again, definitely check out all of Stephen's work on StephenSingular.com. Ton of books, including, of course, Legacy of Deception, Talk to Death, Presumed Guilty, which is all about the John Benet Ramsey. You've got a book on Terrell Owens, all sorts of really, really interesting stuff. So again, definitely go and check that out. And Stephen, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope we can talk again soon.
Thank you, Pierce. It's been very good. Thank you.
Okay, so that was our conversation with Stephen Singular, and I hope all the listeners have been enjoying these podcasts dealing with the OJ Simpson murder trial. As I said during our first conversation with Stephen, we're going to be covering this trial in some detail, and there's still a whole lot more. We're really only beginning to kind of scratch the surface of what was really going on, what were the causes of this, and again, the very important impact that this has had on American society. So we will be returning to the OJ Simpson murder trial in the near future. We might take a little bit of a break, and I've got some other podcasts that I'm going to do, and I've got one that will be released early next week that I've already recorded. So we might wait a little bit, but we will be coming back to the OJ Simpson trial. We're going to have our friend Ed Opperman join us to discuss OJ, and I've got some other ideas as well, so we will be going back to that. But if you've enjoyed this and you want to hear some more of my work, then please go to PorkinsPolicyReview.com. There, of course, you can find all the episodes free for download. You can follow through the RSS feed or through email blasts. You can always follow me on Twitter at PorkinsPolicy. And you can also subscribe to my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/1138Porkins. And again, if you like this work, then please do spread the word, tell a friend, put it up on your social media. Every little bit helps, and I am just, I appreciate everything that the listeners do in promoting the show. So, some quick notes. I know I sound like a bit of a broken record, but the second season of the CIA in Hollywood is finally nearing completion. Tom and I should start releasing episodes that we're going to be doing on a weekly basis within either the end of this month or most likely the first week or two in May. And that is a solid promise. We are going to finish these up and start releasing them. I know I've been getting lots of questions from listeners. Where is the series? When is it going to come out? So bear with us. We've had some stuff just come up that's sort of made it hard to finish the end of it, but we are working diligently on getting it done. Also, Christoph and I will be coming out with a brand new episode of Porkins' Great Game. We should be recording that this weekend or early next week, so I'm going to get that out as soon as possible. And that's going to be a great episode where you got some really interesting stuff that we're going to be covering for this month in terms of the geopolitics of Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the global war on terror. So I think we're going to leave it there. And thank you so much for listening, and I will be talking to you very soon.
Utega chomea, imabiti aba